Okay, so this is the Chapter 3, Segment 1 outline. And the book starts off this chapter, which is the Neuroscience of Behavior chapter, by talking about the structure of the nerve system and looking at it from a microscopic view. So the brain contains billions of neurons or nerve cells. So the brain contains nearly 100 billion neurons. And a neuron is the primary building block of the nervous system, and we're going to go over the structure of a neuron. So the first part of a neuron is the cell body, or the soma, and this is the part of the cell that is surrounding the nucleus. And then there are different attachments that are connected to the cell body. One of these attachments are dendrites, and these are branch-like extensions that receive signals from other cells. And then you have an axon, which is another attachment to the cell body, and this is how a neuron cell sends signals to other cells. So the dendrites receive the signal, it goes to the cell body, then it will transport that signal using the axon. So then in axon terminals, or sometimes called the terminal buttons, are the very tips of the axon that branch into many different endings and pass messages onto other cells. So this is how one single axon can send messages to multiple different cells. Now, the brain is not just made up of neurons, it's also made of glia, which are smaller cells that regulate the strength of connections between neurons. They have structural and nutritional purposes for the nervous system as a whole. And each neuron uses an internal electrical system to sum up all the inputs arriving at its dendrites from other neurons. And so if the sum of the inputs is strong enough, the neurons will then send an electrical signal called an action potential down its axon and each of its many branches. So the cell will receive multiple electrical signals. If the electrical signal is strong enough, or there is a series that take it over a certain threshold, an action potential will be created, and this will then send an electrical signal down the axon. Now, a neurotransmitter, which is also sometimes called a transmitter, is the chemical used by a neuron to transmit information to another cell. And we will be going more into this in this next section, which is neurons communicate with each other at synapses. So the short answer with how neurons send information to one another and transport different signals is that one neuron sends information to another using tiny amounts of a chemical neurotransmitter. So at the end of a neuron, there is a synapse, which is a specialized junction where the axon terminal of a neuron communicates with another cell. Now, in between the two synapses, one of one cell and one of another, there is a synaptic cleft, which is a tiny fluid-filled gap between a neuron's axon terminal and another cell. Now, this is where the messages are sent across. It is sent over the synaptic cleft. So, vesicles are microscopic spheres in a neuron that contain neurotransmitter molecules to be released into the synaptic cleft. So at the synapse, vesicles release neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft, and then these neurotransmitter molecules bind to receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. So that's the membrane on the opposing cell, and this is altering the target's neuron's activity. So these neurotransmitter receptors are large protein molecules embedded in the cell membrane to which neurotransmitters can bind. So neurotransmitters transfer information across synapses, which is kind of what we just talked about when we discussed synapses. So the shape of a neurotransmitter is specific to its target receptor. When the neurotransmitter fits into the receptor, it causes the rest of the receptor to change shape. Once this shape is transformed, a chemical reaction is triggered by the part of the receptor that extends inside the cell. So the actual neurotransmitter molecule never enters the cell. And there are a lot of different neurotransmitters, but the ones included as examples in the book and most commonly referred to or most well known are acetylcholine, which was the first neurotransmitter discovered and used by many parts of the nervous system. Some neurons release acetylcholine into the heart to slow the beating or onto muscles to make them contract. Another neurotransmitter is glutamate, which is one of the most common neurotransmitters in the brain, and it is used in almost every sensory system from pain to vision, and almost always causes neurons to be more active. So then we have GABA, which is an acronym for gamma aminobutyric acid, which usually reduces the activity of neurons. Then we have endorphins. So there are several different types of neurotransmitters that are classified as endorphins because they seem to act as endogenous or internal morphine to damp down pain signals. Then we have serotonin, which both inhibits and excites throughout the brain and the spinal cord. We have norepinephrine, which is released by certain neurons to speed heart rate, breathing, and neuronal activity as a part of the flight or fight response. And then we have dopamine, which is the brain's control of movement and also in signaling pleasure from a wide variety of stimuli, including food, sex, and drugs. Now, neurons come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, and they're found all over the nervous system, but we are first going to classify neurons into 3 functional groups. So the first functional group is motor neurons. So these neurons send commands to make muscles move, and they use acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter. The next functional group is sensory neurons, and they are sensitive to physical events and send information to the brain about them, and they typically use glutamate as a neurotransmitter. Lastly, we have interneurons, which they receive input from and send output to other neurons. So interneurons can be in between 2 other interneurons. They can be in between a motor neuron and a sensory neuron too. So a reflex is a simple behavior that is automatically triggered by a particular stimulation without our conscious effort. And this goes back to the 3 functional types of neurons. So the example that the book has for this is when you place your hand on a hot surface. It's a very quick reflex for you to pull your hand away from the heat, and that's partly due to the different neurons that you have, the different functional neurons that you have within your body. So the sensory neurons detect the heat and release neurotransmitters onto interneurons in your spinal cord. These interneurons then relay the message to the motor neurons, and then the motor neurons release neurotransmitters onto a muscle in the arm, and they cause it to contract and moving your arm away from the hot surface. And one other point that this section talks about is a neural network, which is a wide-ranging scattering of many interneurons communicating with one another to process information, which is kind of what I said earlier, that interneurons aren't just between relaying information between sensory and motor neurons. It can be between 2 other interneurons. This next section, and the last section in the segment 1 for chapter 3, is the nervous system at work, or in the body electric. So every cell in your body is likened to a tiny battery. So any difference in charge particles is called a polarization. So we say that cells are polarized. And we measure the potential for charged particles to move from one place, such as outside the cell, to another, which may be inside the cell, as a potential difference in charge. And the greater the voltage difference between 2 places, the more readily charged particles will flow from one place to another. So in neurons, the potential difference in charge across the cell membrane, called the membrane potential, means that every neuron acts like a tiny battery. And so when the neurons are not being stimulated by other neurons, they have a resting potential, and this is around negative 60 millivolts. So unlike other cells, neurons can change their membrane potential. And that's just the amount of ions and the electrical charge from inside and outside the cell, and that difference. So neurons use electrical signals to summarize information from any synapses, and the difference in charge across the membrane of a cell provides a way for neurons to translate the chemical neurotransmitter signal from a synapse into a tiny electrical signal. And that will be further covered in the following section, going further into how signals are actually transmitted across neurons.